Deadly germs are creeping over the earth, killing every human in their path.
On March 12th of 2020, Broadway closed due to the global outbreak of COVID-19. At the time, it was only supposed to be for 1 month. Theaters all over the country closed their doors and prepared to reopen in a couple of months when the situation improved. And then the situation did not improve. Not even a little. Meanwhile, I was going ahead with a summer project for my college, putting together a series of vlogs about a production of The Tempest I was supposed to be in this summer. It would be staged social distancing style. The audience would be distanced and it would all be outdoors. No problem, right? Things would be better by our start date in July, right? Yeah, no. Well, I still need a project, so I'm going to make it by telling you why this situation is far from unprecedented. In fact, there is a long history of pandemic and social isolation, and these situations have influenced all kinds of art, especially theater. This isn't the first time theaters and live entertainment have had to close as a result of plague, and it probably won't be the last if history is any indication. So, what can we learn from this long history of plague theater? For this project, I examined 5 different case studies of places where theater and epidemic have intersected. This will primarily be taking us through the European and Western theater canon, from the Greeks to the 1990s. While this is a huge range of plays and scholarship, there are several things that many of them have in common, stemming from the use of plague. Each of them falls into one of the categories outlined by Jennifer Cook in her book Legacies of Plague in Literature, Theory, and Film. The first kind of plague play is plague as metaphor. The second kind of plague play is a call to political or social change. And the third kind of plague play is theater as the plague. We will also be examining these plays through the elements outlined by René Girard from his work The Plague in Literature and Myth. 4 elements are: number 1, epidemic contagion; number 2, the dissolving of differences; number 3, mimetic doubles; and number 4, sacrificial elements. While not every play or piece of scholarship we discuss will have all of these elements, they each feature at least one in a prominent position. As we examine these elements and types of plague plays as they appear throughout history, their parallels to our present age become extremely obvious. As I immersed myself in reading these plays and literature about their times, I felt almost a sense of community and hope that through our art, a kind of coming to terms with reality can be achieved. What might come as a comfort or a sense of understanding is the fact that what is happening today during COVID reflects the historical experience of plague and can be seen reflected in the art of the times. Moreover, theater can be a lens to see how oral and written arts can be used to tell the stories of these experiences and grapple with the reality of plague. When examining any play, it is important to understand the political, environmental, and social turmoil that informed it. While a play may not be about a particular historical event specifically, it will, in some way or another, inevitably reflect its historical context. In the case of Oedipus Rex, written by Athenian playwright Sophocles in approximately 429 BC, the tale is actually an adaptation of an already popular story. However, the context of Athens at the time informs how this particular adaptation is told and gives us a view into the ways the Greeks dealt with the tragedy of plague through their art. The story of Oedipus is pretty well known. A Greek king mistakenly murders his father and marries his mother. But for those who don't know the finer details of the play, here's a quick summary. When a plague is brought down on the city of Thebes due to the presence of the murderer of the former king in the city, the current king, Oedipus, seeks to find the killer and expel him from Thebes. Oedipus is the unfortunate subject of a prophecy that says he will kill his father and marry his mother, which has caused him to flee his original home in Corinth. However, through his investigation into the murder, Oedipus discovers that he was actually adopted, and his true biological parents are the former king of Thebes, who Oedipus mistakenly murdered in a conflict while traveling. And his mother is the king's widow, who Oedipus has married. Upon this horrific discovery, Oedipus's mom/wife kills herself, and Oedipus stabs his eyes out upon finding the body. The play ends when he has himself sent into exile in order to save the city from the plague. Given the prominent position of plague in the story, it is no wonder to discover that in real life, Athens had recently been struck by a plague which may have killed up to 25% of the city's population and infected nearly everyone, right around the time that Oedipus premiered. In fact, the aspect of plague is one which Sophocles added to the story, which recontextualizes the entire myth and creates a parallel between Oedipus Rex and the Athenians who would have seen it. In ancient Greek culture, an important scapegoating ritual known as Pharmakos existed as a part of dealing with plagues and other calamities. This ritual used a human sacrifice to carry the sickness out of the city and kill it beyond the city's walls, effectively driving out the plague. This single person is used to stand in for the whole community and carry away their sickness. It is important to note that while Pharmakos is similar to the Judaic ritual of the scapegoat in that they both are symbolic of an entire community, the Pharmakos is a response to crisis that is unconcerned with concepts of sin. Rather, it is used to drive out contagion and disease. The scapegoat, unlike the Pharmakos, is a response to sin and a kind of atonement. To use them interchangeably is to lose their subtlety. For the Greeks, this distinction is important, as their gods were seen as simultaneously the cause of plague and the solution, therefore offering them a physical body which becomes the symbol of the state's suffering is an important way of appeasing them. Oedipus is the most notable literary example of this ritual. He operates as the Pharmakos for the city of Thebes. Although he is not specifically referred to as such, the audience viewing this piece would have been intimately familiar with the ritual, given the recent plague outbreak, and would have understood Oedipus's function as Pharmakos. Through this ritual, Gerard's elements of the plague play are all illustrated and fulfilled in Oedipus Rex. Firstly, Oedipus starts with an element of epidemic contagion through the plague of Thebes. This immediately sets up the play as a plague play, which needs a level of fulfillment through the other elements. The dissolving of differences then occurs when it is uncovered that Oedipus has married his mother. The difference between mother and wife, and brother and son, disappears. Additionally, the difference between king and corruptor dissolves. More complicated are the mimetic doubles. These essentially are referring to points of imitation and desire as something that is copied rather than linear. In Oedipus Rex, this can be seen through Creon, Oedipus's brother-in-law, vying for the throne as Oedipus once did. The fourth and final element, the sacrifice, then fulfills the rest of the play setup through Oedipus himself, going from king to Pharmakos. But why is plague so important to this story? Without the plague, Oedipus's tragedy is solely a personal or family tragedy. With the plague, Oedipus's tragedy becomes a community-wide event. It takes his status as king, the one who is supposed to protect his people, and then turns it on its head as he is the one to bring misfortune down on all of the populace. Further, plague turns Oedipus Rex into a story revolving around ritual. In this same way, theater is a ritual which allows the populace to grapple with the recent tragedy and achieve catharsis. While using theater to grapple with plague and its tragic effects can be cathartic, sometimes a tragedy can be so ubiquitous and normalized that it ceases to contain dramatic potential. In the case of the Elizabethan and Jacobean theater, this was certainly the case. Despite bubonic plague being a constant scourge upon the society, it rarely found its way into the actual texts of plays. It seems that the deadly reality just hit too close to home for the audiences at the time. Everyone knew someone who had died from the bubonic plague, given that it had killed 1/3 of Europe's entire population over the course of the late medieval and early Renaissance eras. However, despite plague's absence on the stage, the reality of the plague's ever-presence in life at the time can be felt through plays and how this deadly reality affected the way theater was performed. Plague was a universal fact of life during this time period. Playwright Thomas Dekker said of being locked in an infected house,
"What an unmatchable torment were it for a man to be barred up every night in a vast, silent charnel house, hung to make it more hideous with lamps dimly and slowly burning in hollow and glimmering corners, where all the pavement should, instead of green rushes, be strewed with blasted rosemary, withered hyacinths, fatal cypress, and yew, thickly mingled with heaps of dead men's bones. The bare ribs of a father that begat him lying there, here the chapless hollow skull of a mother that bore him. Round about him 1,000 corpses, some standing bolt upright in their knotted winding sheets, others half-mouldered in rotten coffins that should suddenly yawn wide open, filling his nostrils with noisome stench, and his eyes with the sight of nothing but crawling worms. And to keep such a poor wretch waking, he should hear no noise but of toads croaking, screech owls howling, mandrakes shrieking. Were this not an infernal prison?"
Luisa Carvajal y Mendoza said in a letter from London to Spain,
"The fear is that the ever-present plague is going to spread. Yet another lovely feature of this place."
Funerals were limited to 6, including the pallbearers and ministers. Doctors and others who tended the sick carried around 3-foot red rods so that others in the streets would avoid them. Dogs, believed to spread the plague, were killed en masse, and bells would constantly be ringing, marking the deaths. For theater practitioners, this meant extremely unstable performance conditions and the constant threat of closure if death counts rose too high. For instance, in August of 1603, death counts in London, which had a population of 200,000 at the time, rose to about 3,000 a week. Playhouses generally closed as soon as death counts rose above 40 a week, so the theaters remained closed through the fall and winter of 1603, and continued to be closed for most of the spring of 1604. These mass closures meant that theater troupes lost much of their primary income, and nearly all public performances in London were stopped. Troupes made money by traveling the countryside or through performing at court. Closures happened again in the fall of 1605 and summer of 1606. These times of closure also meant there was extra time for playwrights such as Shakespeare to work on creating more plays for when the theaters reopened. During the plague of 1606, Shakespeare most likely wrote King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. While plague is never featured as a plot point in any of Shakespeare or his contemporaries' works, mentions of it and the conditions surrounding it are present. In Volpone, one character compares a lady's voice to the bells during plague times. In his play Ram Alley, Lordingberry has a character say of the theater closures,
"I dwindle as a new player does at a plague bill certified 40.
Shakespeare writes of the plague in Macbeth,
"The dead man's knell is there scarce asked for whom, and good men's lives expire before the flowers in their caps, dying, or ere they sicken."
In Antony and Cleopatra, he says a situation is
"like the tokened pestilence, where death is sure."
While none of these directly address the real-life plague, they make allusions which would have been familiar to the audiences of the time. They also demonstrate how ubiquitous plague was for all the people in London and Europe at large. However, while these playwrights never wrote explicitly about the bubonic plague, they did write about another plague which was infecting London at the time: syphilis. While the plague was seemingly random, tragic, and a societal punishment from God, syphilis was seen as a punishment for individual promiscuity and sin. This gave it far more dramatic potential. The plague lacked novelty to Elizabethan audiences, but syphilis was full of novelty. We can see this illustrated in Shakespeare's work, where he wrote explicitly about sexually transmitted diseases in Measure for Measure, Timon of Athens, and Troilus and Cressida. Sexually transmitted diseases also feature prominently in Thomas Decker's The Whore of Babylon, and as a comedic device in several other works during the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras. This distinction between the portrayal of bubonic plague and syphilis in these plays points to another way we can examine the reaction to plague and the way it is portrayed in art, either as a community tragedy or an individual punishment. The invisibility of the plague on the Elizabethan stage also poses a question to our current era. Will we find coronavirus too trite and cliché, or too much of a repetition of our real lives to see it explicitly portrayed on stage? While the Black Death still exists to this day and continued to pop up in epidemic proportions until the 1920s, the last of the great European outbreaks occurred in the late 1700s. The plague disappeared as an influence on the everyday lives of people around the planet. However, its influence on the cultural mindset and its prevalence as a feature of European literature continues to this day. One of the most important pieces of theatrical scholarship on the relationship between the plague and the theater comes from French theater scholar Antonin Artaud, who wrote on the subject in the first chapter of his influential collection of essays, The Theater and Its Double. Antonin Artaud is one of the most significant dramatists and theatrical scholars of the 20th century. He pioneered the form of theater of cruelty and encouraged a move away from rationalism in reverence for the classics in theater. He was a major inspiration for the absurdist movement, and is a particularly important influence on playwright Samuel Beckett and the media philosopher Jacques Derrida. His most basic idea was that theater needs to break away from traditional Western forms inspired by Aristotle's The Poetics, and turn towards art that shocks and awakens the audience's senses. Artaud's ideas are extremely important and hold interest to this day. However, it's important to note that, given he was writing in the 1920s and 30s, he sometimes has some problematic things to say about non-European cultures.
In Mexico, there is no art. Things are made for use, and the world is in perpetual exaltation.
Also, he said some pretty anti-science things to support his arguments, which frankly were unnecessary and do nothing other than to discredit him.
If one wished to analyze closely all the facts of plague contagion that history or even memoirs provide with us, it would be difficult to isolate one actually verified instance of contagion by contact. Personally, I regard this microbe only as a smaller, infinitely smaller, material element which appears at some moment in the development of the virus, but which in no way accounts for the plague.
Yikes, dude. However, given that Artaud's ideas continue to influence theater and offer particular insight into theater's relationship with the plague, it is still worth taking a look at his scholarship. Artaud's argument in Theater and the Plague is simply that theater and plague operate on similar levels. Both create situations in which imagery becomes more potent and free. They are also each a form of spectacle.
From the spiritual freedom from which the plague develops, without rats, without microbes, and without contact, can be deduced the somber and absolute action of spectacle.
He also argues that plague and political turmoil go hand in hand, creating a psychological situation in which compelling images can better take root and usher in social change. This is because the plague causes people to act in nonsensical ways and take on roles outside of the norm. These changes to social roles encourage anarchy within the frightened populace and drive authoritarianism in a government trying to control the plague, creating a situation that allows both theater and plague to open up the imagination to possibilities outside of the everyday norm.
It releases conflicts, disengages powers, liberates possibilities, and if these possibilities and these powers are dark, it is not the fault of plague nor of theater, but of life itself.
Artaud then goes on to argue that theater creates a space for a kind of release in which the conflicts in the real world can be channeled into art. He does this by comparing the collapse of the social order during an epidemic to the theater.
The dregs of the population, apparently immunized by their frenzied greed, enter the open houses and pillage riches they know will serve no purpose or profit.
Anarchy and authoritarianism take hold simultaneously. Then Artaud goes on to show how the theater can provide a space for the same collision of idea and release of energy. This removes the need for upheaval in reality.
The action and effect of feeling in the theater appears infinitely more valid than that of feeling fulfilled in life.
Essentially, theater is a catharsis and life at a whole different level, which creates a space for alleviating the social ills of the real world.
The theater teaches precisely the uselessness of the action which, once done, is not to be done, and the superior use of the state unused by the action in which restores, produces a purification.
The theater can be the scapegoat, providing a place to put all this rage and unrest and release it.
It appears that by means of the plague, a gigantic abscess, as much moral as social, has been collectively drained, and that, like plague, the theater has been created to drain abscesses collectively.
Further, the actor is like the plague victim.
Between the victim of the plague, who runs in shrieking pursuit of his visions, and the actor in pursuit of his feelings, between the man who invents for himself personages he could never have imagined without the plague, creating them in the midst of an audience of corpses and delirious lunatics, and the poet who inopportunely invents characters, entrusting them to a public equally inert or delirious.
These ideas that Artaud proposes, that theater is just like the plague, releasing pent-up energy and being a space beyond normal life, are revolutionary to the form of theater.
If the essential theater is like the plague, it is not because it is contagious, but because, like the plague, it is the revelation, the bringing forth, their exteriorization of a depth of latent cruelty by means of which all the perverse possibilities of the mind, whether of an individual or people, are localized.
However, Artaud does not argue for a theater that specifically addresses politics and social change, or the particulars of social upheaval. By bringing in conflicts from the real world, he does not mean to address the ideology behind these conflicts, but the energy. Artaud argues to change the entire form of theater, to focus on awakening and disrupting norms to achieve emotional release. Theater should be a contagion for all and have no barriers to infect. It should do away with the false dichotomy between audience and performer. All are part of the theater, just as all are subjected to the plague. How to achieve this experience is unclear, as Artaud rarely put on actual theatrical events and produced more theory than concrete theatrical works. For Artaud, we don't actually need to put the plague on stage. Rather, it's a metaphor for the potential of theater. Thank God! Theater isn't actually a plague, it's just a metaphor. Now I can go back to watching my favorite live theater experiences in person without fear of getting an infectious disease. During the 1930s and 1940s, two significant European plague plays were produced, each using the plague as a metaphor for the real scourge of the time: fascism. Prior to World War II, Karl Capek wrote The White Disease, and after the war, Albert Camus wrote State of Siege. Both are structured around an epidemic which assists in a fascist takeover, using the epidemic as a metaphor for fascism and as a method for condemning it. In State of Siege, this is done quite transparently. The dictator who takes over the town is literally called the plague. While an actual sickness is present, its effects are not felt, and it seems like just one of many signs of misfortune which make way for the plague character to take over. The actual plague of importance here is fascism. It lacks a level of resonance with actual plague situations and holds far more merit for its handling of fascism. In contrast, the white disease illustrates both the rise of fascism and how the effects of a pandemic can intersect with an authoritarian government. Additionally, there are many parallels between the fictional government and citizens portrayed in the white disease and the actual reactions of the United States government and its citizens during the COVID-19 pandemic. These similarities are so striking it almost feels prophetic. While the white disease also contained a certain level of prophecy at the time it was written, predicting the Nazi takeover of Czechoslovakia, it also holds resonance to the current situation in the USA. To summarize, the white disease is about a pandemic as it spreads across a country ruled by a right-wing dictator, the Marshal, who does not care about the consequences of the plague and cares only to advance the country's war machine. The story centers around a doctor who finds a cure for the disease, but refuses to reveal it to the world unless the world's leaders agree to world peace and to end all wars. The only people he treats are the most disenfranchised and destitute. As the disease only affects people too old to fight in a war, the government refuses to agree to these terms. That is, until the Marshal comes down with the disease. Eventually, he is persuaded to agree to the doctor's terms, but before the doctor can reach the Marshal with the cure, the last of the cure is smashed, and the doctor is killed by the crowd at a pro-war rally as they cheer, "Long live the Marshal." Now, maybe it's just me, but something about that feels familiar. Where the white disease hit home most for me, however, was in a subplot about an upper middle class family reacting to the disease.
Another article about disease. I wish they'd give us some peace. I have enough to worry about as it is.
That woman on the 3rd floor is having a hard time of it. No one can stand to go in and see her anymore. Haven't you smelled it on the stairs?
No. Look, there's an interview with Dr. Segalius, a man you can trust. A world expert. There, you see? My words exactly.
Meaning?
All that talk about leprosy. It's a lot of hooey. A few scattered cases and the papers blow it up into a catastrophe. You know how people are. Somebody goes to bed with a sniffle and they start crying plague. Nonsense. Pure panic. Interesting what the Segalius says about it starting in China and all. Haven't I always told you we should make China a colony of Europe? Straighten things out for them. The only way we'll get some peace around here. We put up with those backward countries long enough. All that hunger and poverty and no hygiene at all. It's no wonder they end up with leprosy. Look at this. The cure. It was discovered by a fellow named Galen. And this Galen fellow won't give it to any country unless it signs a universal peace treaty.
Well, what's wrong with that?
You can't be serious. How can any country sign a peace treaty after the millions we've spent on arms? Universal peace? Universal crime? They'd have to close down all the Krug's factories. 200,000 people out on the streets. And you ask what's wrong? That peace talk of his, it's downright subversive. They ought to throw him in jail. The nerve of that dirty pipsqueak ordering the world to disarm.
But he's the one who found the cure.
We'll see about that. I bet he's not even a doctor. I bet he's a secret agent, a spy, sent to sow dissension in our ranks. I say throw him in jail first. Ask questions later.
By examining these scenes, we see how the populace is not just complicit in furthering the aims of a totalitarian government, but can actively push its agenda forward. They sow distrust in medical professionals and normalize the brutalization and subjugation of dissidents. Moreover, the white disease highlights how a calamity or natural disaster, such as a plague, can not just be a metaphor for fascism or totalitarianism, but can also demonstrate the role plague plays in assisting these aims. Through plague, a kind of passive genocide can take place in which the government allows undesirables to die by denying them treatment or simply not doing anything to cull the spread of disease. This is a concept we will examine in further depth in the next section. Of course, in the case of the white disease, this allowance of plague to spread comes back to bite the populace and the government through the death of their leader, the marshal. The administration in this case does not mind that the over 50 population is dying because these people do not contribute to the war machine. Further, the white disease highlights how the populace participates by having the crowd at the marshal's pro-war rally actively destroy the cure and kill the doctor who made it. As Jennifer Cook says in her assessment of the white disease,
"It is the crowd that destroys the cure which would save them. The infectiousness of national rhetoric, crude patriotism, and senseless group violence against an outsider fill the distasteful final moments delivered by Capek's pessimistic and prophetic play. War and disease are inevitable. Plague and fascism work hand in hand."
The white disease also continues in the tradition of its Renaissance predecessors in that it takes on a view of plague as a kind of punishment or warning. Plague and the morality of a society are seen as linked. I would expand on this and argue that the presence of plague or natural disaster just exacerbates problems that already existed and destabilizes norms. It exposes the shortcomings of a society while also providing the instability needed to be exploited by bad faith actors. While the white disease at the time it was written may have functioned as a form of political propaganda against dictatorship, it now has a function of portraying the realistic way the actual realities of a military-industrial society deal with plague. Further, the play demonstrates how responses to plague, both by the populace and the government, function as a dramatic spectacle, similarly to what Artaud proposed. Both the anarchist response of a public fearing for their lives and lifestyle, and the authoritarian control of a government trying to stymie plague, function as spectacle. By examining the white disease and state of siege, we can see how art can be used to advocate against political aims, and how plague can function as a metaphor. However, both of these shows, despite not explicitly commenting on governments during a pandemic, also are flexible and can be interpreted in new ways depending on the political climate. But while these plays have political aims, their use of plague as a metaphor ultimately stops short of examining actual government failures in the face of pandemic. So, what happens when there's not just something to fight against, but something to fight for within the context of an actual pandemic? From our current vantage point, it may be easy for young people like me to look at our present situation and say, surely this is unprecedented. For the world at large and the theater community in particular to be so gravely affected by the intentional mismanagement of a pandemic by a right-wing government. Oh wait, the first known cases of what we now know was the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, aka AIDS, in the United States was identified in June of 1981. All of the initial cases identified were in gay men, first in Los Angeles, and then shortly after in New York. Theater practitioner Larry Kramer quickly became involved in AIDS activism, hosting a fundraiser in his apartment as early as August 1981, as the disease spread exponentially through the gay community. The CDC first used the term AIDS in September of 1982, trying to move away from the stigma that AIDS is a gay disease, made common through the use of terms such as gay cancer or gay-related immunodeficiency. The New York Times would not have AIDS as front-page news until May of 1983. It would not be until July of 1983 that Congress would successfully vote to allocate money to AIDS research. In April of 1985, Larry Kramer would open his autobiographical play, The Normal Heart, off Broadway, highlighting the systematic injustices the gay community was facing during the AIDS epidemic. The following month, As Is would become the first play about AIDS to make it to Broadway. Only in September of 1985 would President Ronald Reagan, who had been in office during the entirety of the crisis, mention AIDS publicly for the first time, calling it a top priority after 12,000 Americans had died of the disease in just 4 years. By the time this action was taken, however, it was too late for money. The epidemic had taken hold and continued to spread. To this day, AIDS remains a virus that kills thousands around the world every year. So why does this matter to the theatrical world? A plague is a plague regardless of your job, right? The overlap between the theater community and the gay community is not insignificant. meaning that these artists were particularly affected and galvanized to action as a result of the lack of government response and media response. Many theater practitioners would die over the course of the epidemic. Tom Viola, an HIV-positive gay actor who founded Equity Fights AIDS in 1987, discusses how, of the 8 gay actor friends he dined with and discussed the crisis with in 1984, by 1992, 4 would be dead, and an additional 2 more would be HIV positive.
You would go into a rehearsal period, and before you could get to previews, people would have disappeared. People would have gotten sick and landed in the hospital, possibly to come out, possibly not.
This was the reality for those involved in theater at the time, particularly those in New York and Los Angeles. Viola would go on to merge Equity Fights AIDS with Broadway Cares and the 2 organizations to continue to provide substantial funding to people with AIDS to this day. In the period between 1981 and 1996, a subgenre of AIDS-related theater would develop with a particular focus on using theater as a form of activism. Prominent examples of these AIDS plays include Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart, As Is by William M. Hoffman, Angels in America by Tony Kushner, Falsettos by William Finn and James Lapine, and Rent by Jonathan Larson, the final original AIDS play on Broadway for 23 years. All these works operate as a form of activism, calling to action an audience who might not have been informed about the true tragedy of the AIDS epidemic. However, these plays also draw on the conventions established by previous plague plays. These plays comment on the blurred line between actual bodily sickness and perceived societal sickness and stigmatization. For example, using euphemisms such as the gay plague furthered stigmatizations against the gay community and implied an inherent sickness and homosexuality. In this same way, COVID-19 becomes the China virus. These plays also draw on and argue against the previously used convention of plague as not just a physical ailment, but a moral ailment and a sign of depravity. In the case of AIDS, infection was blamed on promiscuity and lifestyle choices, similarly to how syphilis functioned in Elizabethan theater and was thought of in the culture of the period. However, this link of sickness as metaphor for morality only functioned to further oppress already disenfranchised groups. Therefore, AIDS plays fought against it. These plays don't use metaphors for disease or symbolism. They portray AIDS as something real, as it would have been seen in everyday life. Moreover, they use theater as a way of actively speaking to their audience, imploring them to see the urgency of the situation and to participate in AIDS activism, doing far more than even educational resources were able to at the time. However, the AIDS epidemic, despite the fact that it's seen as something of the past, is not over. People continue to contract and live with AIDS today. In the last decade, AIDS has returned to Broadway as the young gay men who grew up with the original productions of AIDS plays become the theater makers of today. The Inheritance by Matthew Lopez premiered on Broadway in September of 2019, becoming the first original AIDS play to go to Broadway since Rent. This comes after several AIDS-centric plays have been revived on Broadway over the past decade, including The Normal Heart in 2011, Falsettos in 2016, and Angels in America in 2018. These new plays remind us that AIDS is not over and that there is more work yet to be done. AIDS continues to be a part of gay history and art, and its continued presence in the theater world demonstrates how plague, theater, and activism go hand in hand. At the end of June, the Broadway League announced that Broadway would remain closed for the remainder of 2020 and would continue to be dark until at least January of 2021. This ceasing of productions has led to several productions announcing they will not be reopening, including Hangman, which never officially opened as it was still in previews in March, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Beetlejuice, and the largest profile of them all, Frozen. However, Broadway shows closing are only the most prominent of the closures caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Community and local nonprofit theaters who already struggled to survive before the pandemic have been hit far worse than Broadway. Theater has always been dependent on in-person spaces, and in the case of most American theater, has been done in indoor spaces with proscenium stages or maybe a black box. As the virus continues to make in-person theater impossible, looking to the past and to other forms of performance, such as movies and television, have provided some inspiration for how to move forward. Looking at these past instances of places where plague and theater have intersected, it also brings up questions. Will we see plague plays when theaters can reopen someday? Will it be like the AIDS plays or the plague plays of World War II, commenting on government inadequacies and advocating for change? Or will the reality of plague being so tied to our everyday lives make it too difficult to portray in theaters, like during the Elizabethan era? How do we portray a world that looks so different? I don't doubt that many playwrights and performers are grappling with these questions now, and we will probably see new art coming out of this time of isolation like we saw with Shakespeare writing King Lear while the plague ravaged London. But there's also the question not just of content, but, as Artaud reminds us, of structure. The spaces we currently have for theater don't really lend themselves to social distancing, and it's doubtful that people will feel safe returning to a typical auditorium once theaters can reopen. How will our typical theater spaces change as a result of this? How will this structural change ultimately disrupt the way we write and put on plays? And the biggest question of them all, how do we speak to an audience so transformed by such a disruption to the norm? How do we make art for those who have now lived through a plague? I think looking to the past, to Oedipus Rex, to the Elizabethans, to Artaud, to Capek and Camus, and to the dramatists of the AIDS era, may offer us some ideas.